So yesterday we focused on American mobilization for war. We also looked at some examples in the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Passchendaele of what World War I looked like, particularly for European countries before the Americans even arrived. Today we'll start with a quote from President Wilson, but we're going to focus our efforts today on looking at the social issues that existed in the United States as the war would come to a close. And then we'll lead into our discussion, which we will continue on Monday, about Wilson's 14 points. Okay, so looking at this quote from President Woodrow Wilson, this is a statement before the United States had declared war on Germany. He states that lead these people into war and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. Conformity would be the only virtue, and every man who refused to conform would have to pay the penalty. We had already discussed the fact that President Woodrow Wilson ran on the slogan that he kept us out of war as he's being reelected while the First World War is happening in Europe. And he was very slow to want to join into the war, as were many Americans. And this is one of the reasons why, is he feels as if we are going to engage in war, that in doing so, we are going to kind of have to conform our country to being brutal and ruthless instead of being a peaceful force, and that if we are making ourselves do that overseas, that is going to inflict some damage on the American spirit here in the United States. And in some ways, we'll look at examples in which President Woodrow Wilson was correct in this statement. One of the first things that the American government had to do, however, as we declared war in April of 1917, is get the American people, especially those Americans who weren't necessarily agreeing with the United States going to war, get those people to buy into our cause for going into this European conflict. So approximately 11 days after the declaration of war, the Committee on Public Information is created. Essentially, the Committee on Public Information is a government-sponsored propaganda machine. So it's a propaganda agency headed by a former muckraker, journalist George Creel. The campaign promotes patriotism, and it is really trying to create a more clear enemy in the Germans. So we had already seen examples of British propaganda that were trying to entice Americans into the war. And you also saw things like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 that's used as a way to kind of encourage Americans to view the Germans as the clear enemies. And you can see here too with this example of propaganda, this poster here. Obviously, you have an example of an American soldier here holding what appears to be a German soldier from harming an innocent woman. So there were plenty of examples of this, and this one in particular is designed to buy or to promote Americans to buy U.S. government bonds, which we'll talk about here in just a second. It inflamed hatred and violations of civil liberties of certain ethnic groups and opponents of the war. So not only did it make Americans focus on being anti-German, but it also rallied Americans to be anti-pacifists, or people that didn't feel that we were supposed to be involved in the war, which is another topic that we'll talk about here in just a second with the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So the Committee on Public Information had two major tasks. One was raising money. As you can see, this is another example, just like the previous slide, of a propaganda poster that's meant to sell Liberty bonds. And the second major task was convincing the public to support the war. The government was able to raise about 1/3 of the $33.5 billion it needed for the war effort through a progressive income tax. So we had already talked about the 16th Amendment. The progressive income tax that's instilled in 1917 is going to increase the taxes for higher incomes, even more so than what you had seen from the 16th Amendment. There's also taxes placed on tobacco, liquor, and luxury items. And then these Liberty bonds, or Victory Loan bonds. These are essentially where you buy, you are basically going to loan money to the government and buy these bonds, and eventually these bonds will be paid back to you. So if you buy, for example, a $100 10-year bond, you may buy that for $75 from the government. So essentially you loan $75 to the government, and in 10 years they say that they will pay you back $100. So in 10 years you can go cash out this 10-year bond and you get $100. Now if you cash that out beforehand, you will get a reduced rate. So let's say you buy a 10-year bond, a 10-year $100 bond for $75. Well, if that gets cashed out in 5 years, maybe you only get $50 or whatever the rate may be. But that's the way in which these Liberty bonds work. But in order to sell these bonds, the Committee on Public Information really attacked two things. They made it so that you felt as if the Germans were the clear enemy, again with this picture here, beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds, where you have, again, what looks to be like an ocean, and then a German soldier with a bloody bayonet, kind of playing to Americans' emotions, where we already had some negative experiences with the Germans when it deals with traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, and then again making this German soldier look evil. But you also saw the play against American patriotism, where you would have posters that would say only a friend of Germany would refuse to buy war bonds. So if you were one of your friend group or the only one that hadn't bought a war bond, you were seen as somebody that was a friend of Germany. Another way, in this respect, a more forceful way in which the American government promoted American support of the war effort was through the Espionage Act of 1917 and especially the Sedition Act of 1918. So we'll focus more on the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act of 1917 basically made it illegal to do anything that would be supporting enemies of the United States in the First World War. The Sedition Act, however, basically made it illegal to be unpatriotic. So the wording in the Sedition Act said that a person could be fined up to $10,000 and sentenced to 20 years in jail for interfering with the war effort or for saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government or the war effort. So that's a very broad statement, and basically it made it so that if you were somebody that spoke out against the war, you could be essentially thrown in prison. It was definitely a clear violation of the First Amendment. But again, in a time of war, you see people willing to give up some of their individual liberties for things that might be seen as helpful to the war effort. People like Eugene V. Debs, who was a socialist and somebody that wasn't afraid to speak out, was handed a 10-year prison sentence for speaking out against the war and the draft, for encouraging people to not register for the draft. If you watch the crash course, which you should have at this point, John Green talks about how Eugene V. Debs actually runs for president from a prison cell and is actually gaining a lot of American support. Because there were several people that didn't agree with the U.S. entry into the First World War. Another example of where you see the Sedition Act put in place is the landmark Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States. So Charles Schenck was a leader within the Socialist Party. He had printed and distributed anti-draft leaflets, approximately 15,000 of them. And his major argument was the fact that he felt the draft was an example of involuntary servitude, and it was a clear violation of the 13th Amendment. When he was arrested, he was arguing for his First Amendment rights, stating that the Sedition Act was unconstitutional, that it was a clear violation of his First Amendment rights. And in the Supreme Court case, his sentence was upheld with the statement in the establishment of the clear and present danger doctrine, which states that especially during a time of war, any speech that presents clear and present danger is an acceptable limit on First Amendment rights. A good example of this would be like shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's obviously something you can't do. So during a time of war, speaking out against the war was used as an example of clear and present danger to U.S. troops and to the American war cause. So while the Espionage and Sedition Acts were clear examples of pretty negative things socially in the United States during the First World War, we're going to discuss within the next two slides two positive changes that existed within the United States as a result of the First World War. One of the biggest changes that occurred in the United States was through the Great Migration. This isn't something that just happens during the First World War. It just starts during the First World War and increases up until really like the 1960s. But the Great Migration was the large-scale movement of hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks to cities in the North. The reasons for this, one obviously was to escape the racial discrimination that we had already discussed in the South. But the second reason was because of the job opportunities that were left available by the 24 million men that were drafted into the U.S. Army. W.E.B. Du Bois, who we have looked at before, believed that the war provided an opportunity for African American cause for racial justice. So with African Americans taking these jobs, again, it was a way for African Americans to prove their social equality within the United States. In some respects, they were able to gain more of a foothold of equality in the North, but we'll still talk about as we move forward. There wasn't the degree of social change that W.E.B. Du Bois expected. Another group that experiences some social change is women. So just like African Americans fulfilling some of those roles that were left available as a result of the Selective Service Act and the millions of American men being drafted into the U.S. Army, was women. Women also fulfill the roles left vacant by the men. In a quote from Woodrow Wilson, he states that the services of women during the supreme crisis, that being the First World War, have been of the most signal usefulness and distinction. It is high time that part of our debt should be acknowledged. So while this acknowledgement does not mean equal pay, it did help bolster public support for women's suffrage. So the women's suffrage movement had been going on for decades before this, but it's not by coincidence that after the First World War, the 19th Amendment is passed, granting women's suffrage in the United States. So while all this is happening in the United States, slowly but surely, the German Empire is collapsing from within. In November 3rd, 1918, Austria-Hungary surrenders to the Allies. Essentially, this is leaving Germany against everybody else. That same day, German sailors mutinied against the government authority. Socialist leaders within the capital established a German republic on the 9th, and then by November 11th, an armistice is signed. So at the 11th hour of the 11th day on the 11th month of 1918, essentially the fighting in Europe comes to an end. So an armistice, this isn't a treaty, but this is just an agreement to cease fighting. We will talk about the Treaty of Versailles in the end, the official end of the First World War next week. The death toll as a result of the First World War was catastrophic, especially in Europe. 22 million deaths. More than half of these were civilians. We'll talk about one of the reasons why there were so many civilian deaths. War damages cost approximately $338 billion. From what you know from Modern World History last year, we'll talk about who's responsible for paying that debt. And for the Americans, 48,000 Americans die in battle, with another 62,000 dying of disease. So all told, there's just over about 110,000 American deaths, which leaves the other 21,900,000 and some thousand deaths for Europeans. We briefly discussed yesterday how Europeans are going to view the war differently than Americans, and this is one of the biggest reasons. It's because even though the Americans, even though there's over 100,000 deaths for Americans, which is a major deal, there are millions of deaths for European countries. As I just stated, more than half of the 22 million deaths as a result of the First World War were civilian deaths. And one of the biggest reasons for this was the flu epidemic. This was something that was seen in the U.S. It affected nearly a quarter of the U.S. population. 500,000 Americans are killed before it disappeared in 1919, which is a huge number. But again, in Europe, it's even more of an epidemic, as 30 million people worldwide die as a result of the flu epidemic. All told, World War I brought death and disease to millions, but like the flu epidemic, the war also came to a sudden end. The effect that this war has is something that we will really discuss when we get into the Treaty of Versailles and the start of World War II. But essentially, with the amount of deaths that you saw in Europe and even the United States included, the generation, the men ages 21 to 30 that were enlisted in this war, and in European countries, men that were ages 14 up to 40, between the years 1914 and 1918, you really saw the destruction of an entire generation in Europe that is just kind of missing because they were wasted in what seemed to be a pointless war. The end of which, in the agreements that are come to, we will discuss on Monday as we discuss both the American perspective and Wilson's 14 points and what he would like to see as an agreement to end the war, and then what ultimately is decided by the European powers and the Treaty of Versailles.